So we're starting with Dr. Kristi Macrakis, and she is a professor in the School of History and Sociology at Georgia Tech. And then we'll have a presentation from Jelena Subotic, and she's a professor in the Department of Political Science at Georgia State. And then Dr. Uelzmann is a professor of German in the School of Modern Languages here at Georgia Tech. So without further ado.
Hi, well, thanks so much for the invitation. This room is thinned out. I promise I'm not giving a formal presentation. It's actually very informal, peppered with a lot of my own personal experiences. And so I was really, actually, I was pleased to get this invitation in part because it got my juices going about 30 years ago. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it brought me back to those years, which I haven't thought about recently. And so when the Berlin Wall fell, I was actually sitting in my modest apartment as a graduate student in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I saw the event on TV. There were actually tears in my eyes because it wasn't just an event for me, it was actually a personal experience. I had recently come back from divided Berlin. In fact, I lived in the West for a year and a half and in the East for another half year. I had friends there. I knew the country up close and personal, and so it was a very personal experience to me. The tears were tears of joy, not unhappiness. And so my friends had actually called me a wall hopper when I lived in Germany because I was an American. I was allowed to, well, I lived in the West for a year and a half on one fellowship, and then I got another fellowship to go to the East, but I had a multi-entry visa so I could go back and forth. Much to the consternation of some people in the East who were kind of Stalinist hardliners thought I should be locked in like everyone else. But in any case, so it offered me a unique vantage point for experiencing both the East and the West at the same time. So in the decades that follow, actually, this whole event shaped my whole professional and personal experience. I would have not written the books I wrote after the fall of the Berlin Wall if it hadn't happened. So I think this is also a case of how personal experiences affect your own research and trajectory. The main thing that happened, I mean, the whole period was absorbing. I just, couldn't put it down. It was like watching the Snowden revelations today. I mean, I had my eyes glued to the newspaper. And it was absorbing, but it was also heartbreaking because I had a lot of friends who lived in the East who were victims of unification. It wasn't always a happy one, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But what for me was just the most amazing experience was I couldn't believe there was so much activity behind the gray, drab Berlin that I knew as a graduate student. I mean, there was the only color I saw were banners saying, not Sieg Heil Socialism, but something, saying socialism lives, etc. Then when Reagan had his business going, they had anti-SID posters. So the only color I saw was in red because that was the color of socialism and communism. Everything else was gray and drab, and in the winter it was rainy and dark. But there was so much activity happening behind the scenes. In particular, one of my newer research areas, the Stasi, I didn't believe that was all going on, that people were so assiduously building files in this huge bureaucracy on Normannenstrasse, and when I walked by it just looked like an ordinary building. So that was a real eye-opener. And I mean, I think it's an eye-opener to be able to experience that as a historian. I'm a historian, to experience history as it was happening, not only to experience it, but then to study it afterwards. So the event led to my interest in the history of science in divided Germany, and particularly in communist East Germany, and then to the Stasi and the history of espionage. And I don't want to use the word Stasi lightly. I'll define what I mean by that in a second, or what my professional interest was. So the professional and the personal merged in the first project called Science Under Socialism, because it included East and West Germans and Americans, and the idea was for everyone to study a certain aspect of science under socialism, comparing it to the West. And so we had a mixed group of East and West Germans and Americans. We didn't fight, we actually got along. I was hoping for more fiery discussions, but we actually got along pretty well because everyone in the group was fairly sympathetic to everything that was happening. And so it didn't necessarily mirror the divide in Germany at that time between East and West Germans. And then Germany was quickly unified in October of 1990. I was there. I had yet another fellowship. I like getting fellowships, it was free money, right? So I had a fellowship, it was a Humboldt Foundation fellowships. It had a pretentious name, so I won't tell you what it was. But in any case, it got me to Berlin again, and I could experience unification. We were even invited, it was with the Humboldt Foundation, so they got us into all these events. We were invited to the auditorium where unification was happening with all the politicians, so that was pretty exciting. Of course, I kind of thought, judging from a lot of my friends, maybe they should have stayed divorced, but in any case, it was a process of unification, a very painful process of which I wrote as well. The whole process of unification, it was seen as a conquering of East Germany by the haughty West Germans. So to project number 1, Science Under Socialism. So basically, obviously, it left a legacy, and I'm a historian, so I studied what was happening in what's called real existing communism. And there's the abstract communism, there's the ideal communism, and I always kind of thought, well, here we had, Marx from the 19th century plastered onto a modern consumerist 20th century society, and that didn't really work. And of course, science and technology was very consumeristic in the 20th century. I mean, you need materials and items, you need to buy them, and you need them fast. You can't wait for a planned economy for something to come along in the fast-moving field of computers, for instance. East Germany was set by economic shortages. There were lots of problems at the beginning. They were bled white by the Soviet Union because of the legacy of Nazism, so it wasn't easy. Even though East Germany had this utopian ideal of the scientific technical revolution, that they wanted to catch up and surpass the West, that they even had trouble keeping up. And this was also mirrored the Soviet vision about scientific technical progress. So that was project number 1. I mean, as for a historian, it was a nice experiment having, it was a lab, East and West. Well, what happens in science in each country under 2 different regimes? So the second project, the Stasi, and when I use the word Stasi, I'm not using that in a pejorative sense, although most people use it that way. I'm just using it short for Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, Ministry for State Security, because most people recognize it as the Stasi, but the Stasi is pejorative. It is kind of like saying you're a Nazi or something. So, but I'm not using it in a pejorative sense. And the other problem with the term Stasi is that the Stasi actually had 2 elements to it. The one that most people know, the snitches, people spying on each other, children spying on their parents, husbands spying on wives, and that poisonous society it created of informants. So that's one side of the Stasi that most people know about, and that would be, that was the sort of secret police aspect of it. But there was also another part of the Stasi which most people not everyone knows a lot about, foreign intelligence. That's the equivalent to what the CIA or MI6 does. That is, they steal secrets from the West or the other side. And that's what I was interested in, was foreign intelligence, in particular in science and technology. And basically that was all about stealing Western science and technology and bringing it to the East and trying to incorporate it into this rickety economic structure. It wasn't always very successful, but in the short term, it did fill some gaps and holes in, but in the long term, of course, it stunted a lot of creativity and it didn't really help. In fact, I think their quest for computer technology led to the implosion of East Germany in 1989. Again, that was the Stasi, and of course your image of the Stasi may be those miles and miles of files that they flashed on TV. The problem was, of course, with foreign intelligence is they destroyed a lot of their files, claiming that, well, in the West, they wanted to protect their sources and methods and protect the agents. The sad part is that a lot of the agents, that is a secret agent sent to the West to steal secrets, not an informant to spy on you. So the problem was that in a Nacht- and Nebel-Aktion, the CIA actually succeeded in acquiring these files which had all the real names of agents and things on them. So then you could piece together, and also investigative organizations in Germany could piece together this information and arrest people. But as for a historian, it was also nice. It took a while, but I finally got access to those. But it was kind of sad because the people ended up staying in jail, and then for a historian, the files weren't there, just the bones were there, not the actual real case files. So that was the Stasi. And when I reflected on it after you asked me to talk, I thought, gosh, that feels just like yesterday now that she mentioned it. But then I looked up at the moon and go, but it's that distant as well. I have to put my telescope on and bring it back into focus. So although my visits to Germany decreased because I finished those projects on science under socialism and the Stasi, but I still go because people think that's all I do, so I go again and talk about those things or when I'm there. But I think I've gone enough to know that those 30 years haven't been enough to merge East and West Germany. The East is still much poorer. There's been, there was that conquering mentality I already spoke about, which the Easterners resented. And as was mentioned, there's also a lot of anti-foreign sentiment in the East. I think there was a recent incident of emigres being attacked. There was also a scramble for jobs. So anybody with any association with the Stasi was kicked out no matter what they did. Those with clean records profited. I think of some of my colleagues, I don't know any of their names, so I'll just say their first names. My friend Dieter got a tenured position at the Max Planck Institute because he was clean. He was neither a Stasi informant or agent or officer, nor was he in the party. But unfortunately, my betreuer, who was my advisor, Reinhard, he wasn't in the Stasi. He totally rejected that because they tried to recruit him, actually, when I was there, because they wanted him to spy on me. But he was actually a member of the party. There was nothing wrong with being a member of the party, the Communist Party, but so he was kind of maligned, I think, and so he had to actually emigrate to Norway. I just Googled him after you invited me. I see he's a professor there, which I'm pleased about. But the irony is that he used to write about mathematical emigres from Nazi Germany, mathematicians who emigrated from Nazi Germany, and the poor guy had to emigrate himself. I was going to email him and ask him about that irony. But in any case, so the East and West, I think, are still like South and North, the way it was in America, South and North. Of course, we've merged closer together. And it's not clear if and when the East will resemble the West, the modern, the rich, etc. But there is some nice culture, so I brought a prop. This is one of my favorite posters in my office. For those of you who don't know German, it says, it says, uns gab nur einmal, we only existed once, that's East Germany. I mean, it's a remarkable event in history that you have a state that existed for only 40 years and then disappeared. So I like this poster, so it has a half-burned candle. That's the East German flag right here, and then it's burning halfway. So I really love this poster. It was actually from an event at a cabaret called the Distel, which is across the street from Bahnhof Friedrichstrasse. It's still there, I looked it up. But since I'm getting to the point of culture, part of this session was supposed to be culture and society, so I'm getting to culture right now. So this was in I don't remember when I went, because I went back and forth a lot in the 90s, but there was a lot of cool culture in the East. As I said, it used to be drab and dark and nothing was going on. If you walked the streets at night, it was dark and drab. But after unification, it livened up a lot. There are even streetwalkers down the street and everything and from the west imported to the east. But there was wonderful cabaret and satire and just cabaret about all the events that were going on that was really funny. And so that street also livened up. There was Tacheles, the art building. It was just this decrepit building that artists turned into this impromptu art gallery. So in terms of culture, East Berlin really thrived. And of course, it's a magnet. My student Mario is living in Prenzlauer Berg, which is in the east, which has become gentrified. It just used to be another working class neighborhood in East Berlin, but now it's become gentrified. And so the cabaret was actually, interestingly right across the street from Bahnhof Friedrichstrasse, and I remembered Bahnhof Friedrichstrasse from my days as a student when I would cross the border and I'd see all these jackbooted policemen with their German Shepherd dogs, and the green pallor of the light on the guards at the border. And of course now it felt really funny just walking through without having to show anyone anything or them smiling at you. And so no more passing through this stringent border control. And so now I just want to briefly turn to society. Of course, during the early years, the legacy of the Stasi permeated a lot of society, and I want to say it was poisonous. It poisoned a lot of society because it opened up all this Pandora box of very poisonous secrets, again, of those children spying on their parents and just horrible things that happened. Now I think that's lessened a lot. In fact, I don't think there's a real big interest in the Stasi anymore. I mean, there was at first, and it was in all the headline news all the time. So-and-so was in the Stasi, so-and-so was in the Stasi. So that's died down a lot, which is good, so maybe it can be used for serious historical research. The archives, of course, the archives opened up that you could use them for serious historical research. So just to conclude, yes, East Germany only existed once, uns gab's nur einmal, and it was a unique and strange dissolution of a separate country that had grown apart, but yet it was one. And so I think despite the hardships, historically, it offers a fascinating look into the ways in which Western-style democracy and Eastern-style communism shaped the structure and content of science or of espionage. Yet simultaneously, it's a sad human story of lives affected by great historical events.
So I have pictures, so let's see if we can make that happen.
So thank you very much, Claire, for inviting me. As Claire said, I'm a professor of political science across town at Georgia State University, and I study memory politics, specifically the politics of memory in East and Central Europe. And I have just published my second book. It's literally hot off the presses. And so I wanted to use this opportunity to tell you a little bit about what my work is and present the research that I've been doing over the last at least 4 years. And that I presented in some form earlier at Georgia Tech, I think last year. In October 2017, a commemorative plaque in memory of the 200,000 Poles murdered in Warsaw in the German death camp KL Warschau was unveiled in Warsaw. This was a somber ceremony with a local priest performing Catholic rites and a representative of the Polish army honoring the dead. The only problem, almost none of this was true. There indeed did exist a camp in Warsaw where a few thousand Polish citizens died during the German occupation. But after the burning of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, this camp was turned into a concentration and extermination camp for Jews brought in from other parts of Europe who were used as slave labor to clear the charred remains of the ghetto. A total of some 20,000 people died in this camp, most of them Jews. The Polish citizen movement behind this commemorative project was therefore not just commemorating victims of their own ethnic group at the expense of other victims. This is an unremarkable and largely ubiquitous feature of commemorative politics everywhere. What is, however, remarkable is that the very clear purpose of this commemoration was to put it in direct competition with the memory of the Holocaust, especially in Poland, the geographic heart of the genocide. This new historical remembrance in Poland has been going on for quite some time and has attracted much international attention. In 2018, the Polish government passed a law that criminalized the use of the phrase Polish death camps to designate German Nazi death camps in occupied Poland, such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and many others, but also criminalized any insinuation that individual Poles may have committed anti-Jewish crimes during the Holocaust. At its most extreme, the new Polish remembrance has inverted even the basic understanding of the Holocaust, as in this cartoon published in a right-wing Polish magazine that depicts the Holocaust, the alleged annihilation of Poles by collaborating Jews and Nazis. Poland is hardly alone, and as I document in my new book, Yellow Star, Red Star, Holocaust Remembrance After Communism, this new historical revisionism has been flourishing across post-communist Europe, and is especially visible in historical museums, monuments and memorials, history textbooks, and rehabilitation and restitution laws. I found a remarkably strong but nationally flavored trend of appropriation of Holocaust memory, especially its narrative and visual repertoire, to instead tell the story of communist oppression. For example, in 2014, the Historical Museum of Serbia in Belgrade, where I'm from, put up a highly publicized exhibition that was called In the Name of the People, Political Repression in Serbia from 1944 to 1953, which promised to display new historical documents and evidence of communist crimes carried out by communist Yugoslavia in the first post-war years. The most stunning visual artifact displayed, however, was a well-known photograph of emaciated prisoners, one of them Elie Wiesel, in the Nazi Buchenwald concentration camp, taken by a United States Army soldier at Camp Liberation in April 1945. That's the original on the right. The original is on the right. In the Belgrade exhibition, which is the picture on the left, this canonic image, one of the most famous photographs of the Holocaust, was displayed in the section devoted to the Yugoslav communist era camp for political prisoners on the Adriatic island of Goli Otok, with the following caption: "The example of living conditions of Goli Otok prisoners." End quote. The visual message of this display was very clearly that communist oppression looked just like the Holocaust. Similarly, in Hungary, the House of Terror Museum that opened in 2002 in Budapest narrates the story of Hungary's 20th century experience as a nation victim of the foreign communist and to a much lesser extent foreign fascist regime. The House of Terror goes out of its way to bring home the message that fascism and communism were flip sides of the same coin. There are multiple visual representations of black totalitarianism and red totalitarianism, of the black arrow cross juxtaposed with a red star, of the fascist uniform juxtaposed with a communist uniform. Obviously, the equation of the two totalitarian regimes is not new, nor particularly surprising. What is more interesting is that the blunt message of this state institution is presented through the appropriation of not just Holocaust imagery, but also Holocaust museum visual displays. Most directly, the House of Terror uses the model of the Tower of Faces, portraits of Holocaust victims projected onto the entire length of walls in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., to project portraits of Hungarian victims of communism. While also in the House of Terror, the Hall of Tears in the basement of the Budapest Museum is a visual repurposing of the Children's Memorial at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Under the government of Viktor Orban, Hungary has further embarked on a spectacular urban revisioning of its 20th century history. The memorial to the victims of the German occupation, erected in Budapest in 2014, memorializes Hungary, the country, as the main victim of the German occupation, by a not very subtle depiction of Germany's imperial ego crushing of Hungary, which is symbolized by Archangel Gabriel. The memorial was unveiled overnight and with no accompanying official opening ceremony in order to avoid any public debate and expected protests. Indeed, immediately upon unveiling, Holocaust survivors or their family members placed hundreds of handwritten notes, pictures, and objects that you can see at the bottom outside the memorial. They told the story of 430,000 Jews who were deported from Hungary, mostly to Auschwitz, the quickest rate of deportation in the history of the Holocaust, taking less than 2 months, and done with the active participation of Hungarian civil servants. In a manner similar to many new public monuments, museums, and memorials across post-communist Europe, the Budapest Memorial uses architecture as a tool to express myths of nationhood as part of a state strategy of new visual remembrance of the past. Specifically, it narratively replaces the memory of the Holocaust and the catastrophe of Hungarian Jewish annihilation as the central memory of World War II in Hungary, with the memory of Hungarian victimhood and innocence. It also purposefully replaces the responsibility for the murder of Hungarian Jews from Hungary's Axis allied government and places it firmly with Germany, presenting fascism and its exterminationist policies as alien, foreign intrusions into the Hungarian body politic. And this shift, therefore, completely removes the history of the Holocaust in Hungary before the German occupation in 1944. The period that left 60,000 Hungarian Jews killed as early as 1942, the extermination carried out not by Germans, but by Hungarian forces under the rule of Regent Miklós Horthy. So this new type of Holocaust remembrance that I document in the book is not exactly denial. Viktor Orbán even declared 2014 a year of Holocaust commemoration. However problematic, it does not prominently feature voices that deny the Holocaust as a historical fact, nor challenge its most established realities. It is also not quite the same as trivialization. While the emphasis always is on the larger ethnic suffering, it is relatively rare to hear outright belittling of Jewish victimization. A more nuanced way of understanding this type of Holocaust remembrance is as memory appropriation, where the memory of the Holocaust is used to memorialize a different kind of suffering, such as suffering under communism or suffering from ethnic violence perpetrated by other groups. And as I demonstrate in the book, this process is not simply a byproduct of post-communist transitions. It is in fact an integral part of the political strategy of post-communist states, which are basing their contemporary legitimacy on a complete rejection of communism and the renewed connection to the pre-communist, mythically, nationally pure, and above all, ethnic character of states. It is this rejection of communist doctrinaire supranationalism and its replacement with old-fashioned ethnic nationalism that colors how the Holocaust is remembered. And so in a global environment of anti-communism since 1989, this nationalized Holocaust remembrance has also completely erased the memory of communist anti-fascist resistance as its constitutive part. And this exclusion provides contemporary anti-communist regimes their legitimacy shields. Holocaust remembrance, then, is no longer about the Holocaust at all, but is about very acute legitimacy needs in post-communist states, which are building their identity today as fundamentally anti-communist, which then in turn helps them be perceived as more legitimately European. So to understand this process, I argue that post-communist states today are dealing with conflicting sources of insecurity. They're anxious to be perceived as fully European by core Western European states, a status that remains fleeting, especially in the aftermath of the openly anti-East European rhetoric of the Euro crisis and Brexit. Being fully European, however, means sharing in the cosmopolitan European narratives of the 20th century, perhaps the strongest being the narrative of the Holocaust. The European narrative of the Holocaust, which understands it as the foundational block of post-war European identity, has created stress and resentment in post-communist states, which have been asked to accept and contribute to this primarily Western European account as members or candidate states of the European Union. The problem is that the cosmopolitan Holocaust memory as developed in the West does not narratively fit with a very different set of Holocaust memories in post-communist Europe. This lack of fit is evident primarily in the lack of centrality of the Shoah as the defining memory of the 20th century experience across the post-communist space. Instead of the memory of the Holocaust, Eastern European states after communism constructed their national identities on the memory of Stalinism and Soviet occupation, as well as pre-communist ethnic conflict with other states. The European centrality of the Holocaust then replaces the centrality of communist and ethnic victimization as the dominant organizing narrative of post-communist states, and is therefore threatening and destabilizing to these state identities. So to conclude, in the book I document how influencing the European Union's own memory politics and legislation in the process, post-communist states have attempted to resolve these insecurities by putting forward a new kind of Holocaust remembrance, where the memory, symbols, and imagery of the Holocaust become appropriated to represent crimes of communism. The criminal past is not fully denied, but the responsibility for it is misdirected. And this accomplishes two things. It absolves the nation from acknowledging responsibility for its criminal past, while at the same time it makes communism as a political project criminal. By delegitimizing communism, post-communist states have also removed anti-fascist resistance from the core memory of the Holocaust, which has allowed for a revival and ideological normalization of fascist ideological movements in the present. But the centrality of the Holocaust as a foundational European narrative is also soundly rejected across much of post-communist Europe because of its perceived elevation of Jewish victimhood above victimhood of other regional majority ethnic groups, a move that is increasingly openly resented. Further, the European Holocaust memory's focus on Jewish suffering is also begrudged in much of the region because it brings about discussion about extensive and deep local complicity in the Holocaust and material and political benefits of the complete Jewish absence across Eastern Europe. Jewish businesses, homes, and property have over decades of looting, followed by communist seizures, slowly morphed into the general economy with difficult and sporadic attempts at restitution. Contemporary Holocaust remembrance practices, such as those sanctioned by the Polish or Hungarian governments, avoid these difficult discussions by deflecting all responsibility for the genocide of the Jews onto Nazi Germany, absolving the national past from any appearance of impropriety and crime. So my book aims to put these episodes of memory inversion in a contemporary political context by arguing that they're not isolated instances of competing memory, but instead critical elements of national strategies of political legitimacy. They serve to reposition national narratives in opposition both to those of communism, but also those historically embraced by Western Europe, and instead reclaim a national identity that rejects multiculturalism and is rebuilt along ethnic and majoritarian lines. It is quite clear, and this is my last point, that cultural issues of identity and history have been integral to the rise and consolidation of populism in post-communist East Europe, as the question of who are the real victims of history has been central to the populist enterprise. The fact that East European victimization under communism is not adequately understood and appreciated in the West is the central grievance of these movements, and it feeds into a new cycle of victimization. This time, the perceived oppression by Western liberal ideas such as gender ideology, feminism, LGBTQ rights, or even more dramatically, Middle Eastern migration and refugee flows. The core of populist resentment is the issue of cultural imposition, and the deepest cultural imposition is the imposition of memory of their own pasts. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me to this event. Thanks so much for inviting me. My talk is entitled The Wall in People's Heads. In early 1990, when Germans found themselves on an accelerating trajectory towards reunification, I was 15 years old and I attended the 9th grade at a gymnasium in a small town near Hamburg in West Germany. The fall of the wall a few months before, on November 9th of 1989, had not really affected me that much. As with most of my friends, my preoccupations were the ones of a teenager. So sports, guitars, friends, worlds away from German or even world politics. In fact, I have to admit that we even poked fun at the first East German cars, the Trabis, when they appeared on the streets of my town just a few days after November the 9th. While hectic activity broke out in Bonn and Federal Chancellor Helmut Kohl postulated his 10-point declaration laying out the steps towards German unity, life went on pretty normally in my hometown. In early spring of 1990, with the German reunification now officially on the agenda, my classmates and I were informed that we would visit a GDR school in our partner city of Wittstock, a town of about 15,000 in Brandenburg. We were put on buses and driven eastward for the day trip. What I still remember vividly is the shock of arriving in the GDR and leaving the bus to take my first look around behind the formerly impregnable Iron Curtain. I was struck by the way the cold and wintry air smelled of burning coal, used widely for heating in the town's old houses, by the state of disrepair of many rows of houses and streets, and by the sights and sounds of the GDR two-stroke engine cars. To me, as a schoolboy from the West, the GDR was indeed an unknown country, or rather a version of Germany in a parallel universe. I had a black and white film in my camera, and I had somehow thought this was appropriate for the occasion, and I took an entire roll of photos, some of which I still have today. These photographs show us West German kids in our down jackets, our Levi's jeans, our Nike sneakers, and Adidas backpacks, looking lost among rows of gray streets, posing in front of posters with what we thought were stereotypically socialist slogans. When we met in 9th grade, a class from the local school, I remember the encounter as awkward and formal. These were Germans like us, we had been told, but we had our doubts that we had anything in common. To be honest, we were all glad when we were allowed back on the bus that would carry us back westward, back to the lives, the sights, sounds, tastes, and smells that we knew to be completely different from what we saw that day. Even if this first foray eastward was a mixed success to our students, my school's efforts to forge partnerships behind the former Iron Curtain continued in the form of a 2-week exchange with the Város Major Gymnasium in Budapest, Hungary. On the way to Budapest in late September 1990, shortly before the 3rd of October, the day of German reunification, we had to change trains in Dresden, and we had a few hours to spare. Again, the city seemed fundamentally different on every central layer. I have snapshot-like memories, like picking up some GDR coins made out of almost weightless aluminum that seemed to us like monopoly money, fake and worthless, since the currency reform of July 1st of 1990 had brought the GDR the Deutsche Mark. During my time in Budapest, as I enjoyed the fantastic city and the hospitality of my host family, it dawned on me that the pocket money I brought from the Federal Republic roughly equaled the family's monthly income, and that perhaps it was not okay to blow it all on comparatively expensive Hungarian delicacy foods or Soviet sparkling wine, which was quite big among my group. On my way back home, I passed the same border inspection point on the GDR border from 2 weeks ago, with the exception that now it actually was the Federal Republic. I have a passport with the 2 stamps, one stating German Democratic Republic and the newer from the Federal Republic, side by side. These are my teenager memories of both historic and historical events that I experienced as a mere backdrop of my life. I find it ironic that given how marginally interested I was in the events unfolding around me when I was 15, I eventually became an avid student and then a scholar of German cultural history of the 20th century, particularly the Cold War period. And here's a brief plug for my book. Staging West German Democracy examines how governmental PR films were used to promote democracy in West Germany during the Adenauer period. It's excellent, you should all get it. In West Germany, yes. Now I regularly get to tell my students about the events of the German reunification. Here on campus and during the Berlin Albert study abroad, I emphasize how fundamental these changes subsumed in German under the word Die Wende, a sharp turn, are to understanding German society today. One important insight for my students is that studying the GDR and its culture is not just about the Cold War, about communism versus capitalism, about state surveillance and the Berlin Wall. The insight that many East Germans lived meaningful and fulfilled lives in the GDR that was subsequently sharply altered is perhaps most important for my students to understand many of the complicated East-West dynamics in Germany today. To many visitors of Germany, the conflicts between Ossis, Easterners, and Wessis, Westerners, are not always outwardly present. The many successes of the reunification have ensured that the infrastructure in the East is nowadays mostly the same, if not more modern than the West, and life as an exchange student in Dresden does not differ significantly from studying in Hamburg today. To the uninitiated, it often comes as a surprise that in a way the unification process is still not complete for everyone and everywhere. And many debates still exist in Germany regarding equity between East and West. Differences in pay, quality of living, economic prospects, and immigration, just to name a few. One central issue in German society today is facing seems to be that after nearly 30 years as a reunified country, the long-term effects of 40 years of division and the lived experiences under socialism versus capitalism are still hard to weave together. For many Easterners today, the socioeconomic hardships they experienced after the Wende and continue to endure today translated into the feeling that they are not really part of the new Germany. Some feel their voices and identities were erased during the Wende and are still not acknowledged. There still is a wall in people's heads for some, even after the physical structures that separated the country were removed. So in spring of this year, I decided to teach a new course with exactly this title, devoted to exactly this problem. The premise was to delve into the reasons for the continued existence of this mental wall by examining the history of the economic, political, and social developments in Eastern Germany in relation to West Germany. Students studied the profound differences between growing up in East and West Germany, learned of the often devastating economic effects as the state-led Treuhandanstalt radically and irrevocably forced the GDR's defunct state economy into capitalism, heard testimonials of Eastern and Western lived experiences of the Wende years, analyzed the economic situation of the East as compared to the West nowadays, and pondered the shifts and geographical differences in the East and West German political landscape. Many of these debates can be traced back to July 1st of 1990, the day of the currency union between East and West that preceded the actual reunification on October 3rd. On that day, Helmut Kohl held his famous speech in which he promised East Germans an imminent future of flourishing landscapes as an outcome of the fast-track to reunification he pursued. This image stuck in many people's heads and turned into bitter irony when the economic restructuring under the Treuhandanstalt resulted in mass layoffs, I believe about 2 million jobs lost, and economically disenfranchised regions in the East, the effects of which are still ongoing. When during a visit to the East German town of Halle an der Saale in May 1991, and after a landslide re-election, the first federal election of 1990, Kohl was pelted with eggs thrown by angry demonstrators and furiously fought back. The signs were already clear that turning back the clock on some 40 years of state socialism would not be that easy. At this point, nerves on both sides were frayed. Popular anger in the East, especially by those who could not transition easily into the new system and find new validation in careers and economic prosperity, continued while life changed rapidly and fundamentally in East Germany. The psychological stress imposed upon Easterners was enormous. For many people, the rug was being pulled out from under their feet. Finding new work was challenging and especially difficult for older East Germans. For those who had not only arranged themselves with the system but had made careers in it, the fall was even greater. I met a building custodian at Technical University Berlin this year who told me to my great surprise that he had been an officer in the East German Air Force between 1990 and had flown in fighter jets. A big change to compare to what he's doing now. In my course, students read literary texts by Easterners that argue that a Western master narrative overrode and displaced their identities and lives by systematically discrediting their life's work under socialism, or by overriding the architectural landscapes of their cities, by renaming streets and tearing down buildings and monuments. In her memoir, Zonenkinder, Zonal Children, journalist Jana Hensel assembles an archaeology of her childhood that was, quote, lost during the events of the reunification and its aftermath. To Hensel, the day that she and her mother took part in a Monday demonstration marks, quote, the last day of my childhood. Today, she cannot recognize the places of her childhood anymore in her hometown of Leipzig, among renamed streets and shopping areas littered with discount stores. And I quote, "Everywhere in the 1990s, there never seems to have existed a different decade on the soil of the GDR. They swiftly had eradicated the 60s, 70s, and 80s before our eyes. The East had become void of history," unquote. Perhaps given the rise of populist rhetoric today and the attack on long-established democratic traditions and institutions in the West, students were particularly interested in the Alternative für Deutschland, or AfD, a right-wing populist party with a strong anti-immigrant and anti-Islam rhetoric. It has seen exponential growth in representation in Germany, particularly in the eastern state parliaments. Last weekend, the AfD won 23.4% in Thüringen. It is now the second strongest party, and the AfD is currently the strongest opposition party in the Bundestag with 12.6%. While there are no easy answers to the significantly stronger representation of the AfD in the East, students considered several points of access to the problem, among them the nature of populism, protest against ongoing economic disadvantages, the historical lack of exposure to immigration, and actually the present lack of exposure to immigration in many cases, and others. However, students learned as well that, of course, East Germans regularly stand up against hate and reject racism and neo-Nazis in their cities, and that the AfD's extremist Völkisch ideologue Björn Höcke, who famously declared the Holocaust Memorial in downtown Berlin to be, quote, "a monument of shame," is a Westerner. Students were also interested in the political dominance of the socialist Die Linke party in the East, which won 31% of the popular vote and as the strongest political party in Thuringia last weekend. They observed that while parties on the left and right dominate in East German state parliaments, the established centrist parties of the West, the SPD and Merkel's CDU, continue to suffer huge losses in these elections. Apart from the ongoing economic difficulties in many, especially rural areas of East Germany, nothing hints as clearly as the wall in people's heads as the divided political landscape of Germany. But how to break down this wall, we asked in my court. In 2017, Saxony's State Minister for Equality and Integration, Petra Köpping, a social democrat, published an intervention that created much discussion in Germany. Her book has a provocative title, "Integriert doch erstmal uns." Why don't you integrate us, the Easterners, first, in reference to the so-called refugee crisis of 2015, during which Germany accepted close to 1 million refugees. Köpping went to demonstrations of the AfD and the anti-Islam citizens initiative Pegida and spoke to the participants in an effort to understand their opinions and fears. Part of her argument is that the right-wing political protest movement in the East can be traced directly back to the effects of the Wende. The tenor of her conversations with concerned citizens reveals that almost 30 years after the Wende, a significant portion of the population in East Germany is still in need of proper integration into the FRG in socioeconomic terms and feels largely ignored by the FRG's mainstream political discourse. Köpping's book, which goes far beyond the issue of political populism, sheds new light on a well-known issue. During the Wende and beyond, much of the Easterners' memory of their lives in the GDR was systematically discredited, often ridiculed, and deliberately overwritten with the Western narrative that emphasized the collapse of the GDR's economy due to an inherently deficient economic system. Like their economy, the Easterners' lives, it seems, had been in vain, amounted to failure. After Ostalgie, a relatively harmless wave of nostalgia for the GDR in the early 2000s, reflected sentimentally on the GDR's material culture and traditions, the cultural differences now seem even more entrenched and are argued through a protest that frequently rejects mainstream politics as represented by the political cumbersome Great Coalition in Berlin led by Angela Merkel. Therefore, while acknowledging the many successes, Köpping demands that a more coherent and concerted effort to reach out to Easterners who continue to suffer from the negative socioeconomic effects of die Wende should be undertaken. And I quote, "To speak about the problems of the post-Wende period does not imply to talk badly about German unity. The peaceful revolution and the reunification are instances of exceptional blessing in German history, and of course, an astounding amount of issues went well. But in view of all this, one should not forget the people and should take seriously existing emotions of many of us Easterners. Only when injustices are also named as what they are, and when there is a will to remedy these, can indignities, insults, and deflective stances be overcome. Only then can a democratic public take hold, unquote. As Köpping argues, listening and acknowledging that mistakes were made in the last 30 years, that the flourishing landscapes had largely been an exaggeration, would go a long way and put the challenging dialogue about the after effects of the Wende onto a more promising foundation. Lastly, an example for an effort to listen and understand rural East Germany we read in my course is Deutschboden, a 2008 report of several months spent in a nameless East German small town by the Westerner Moritz von Ustler. Von Ustler's method of participant observation from the perspective of the uninitiated outsider takes the reader deep into the intricacies of the local culture of the town and lends voice to the lived experience of its inhabitants. Von Ustler's character study of the small town in Brandenburg and its inhabitants renders a positive image of a distinct and vital East German identity that confidently acknowledges and incorporates its GDR heritage, and that the Western narrator sets about exploring like an unknown universe. Perceptive efforts like von Ustler's, one could argue, bring this necessary German-German dialogue forward. To conclude, it's worth pointing out that for the last 14 years, Germany has now been led by a woman from East Germany, who has lived through and actively engaged with the political processes of the Wende. As Angela Merkel has hinted at during her famous 2019 address at Harvard, in her path from the GDR to the leader of a major Western democracy, she is an example for the tremendous opportunities that have become possible for East Germans after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Still, a rising number of protesters in the East made it clear that they do not consider Merkel one of their own and accuse her of ignoring their concerns. As long as we do not adjust our public memory of the post-Wende period, and with that introduce a narrative of the events of 1989-90 and their long-term effects that includes the perspective of all Germans, the wall in people's heads will remain.